Every city fire in the 1800s follows the same pattern. Massive urban centres reduced to ash overnight. Official reports blame candles, lanterns, careless smokers. Then crews arrived to rebuild at impossible speed, raising new structures in months that supposedly took decades to construct originally. Chicago burns in 1871. By 1893, it hosts the World's Fair in buildings that look ancient, permanent, as if they'd stood for centuries. Something doesn't add up. I started tracking these fires after noticing architectural impossibilities scattered across North America. Buildings too grand for frontier towns. State capitals in locations that barely qualified as settlements when construction allegedly began. Ornate facades and engineering precision that required generations of mastery, appearing in places where skilled craftsmen supposedly didn't exist. The Iowa State Capitol stands as the most obvious example. This structure, with its mathematical proportions and sophisticated construction, emerged from prairie land that official records claim had minimal infrastructure. The standard explanation crumbles under examination. We're told these buildings represent the triumph of westward expansion, proof of American ingenuity and determination. But that narrative requires us to ignore what we can see with our own eyes. These aren't rough frontier constructions refined over time. They're masterworks from day one, displaying knowledge of architecture, mathematics, and engineering that doesn't match the supposed capabilities of their builders. Stand inside any major state capital from the 1800s. Notice the ceiling heights, the acoustic properties, the way natural light flows through spaces designed with precision that modern architects study but rarely replicate. These aren't happy accidents. They're evidence of deliberate mastery. Now ask yourself where that mastery came from in territories that official histories describe as wilderness, just years before construction began. The mud flood theory offers a different framework. Not a literal flood of mud covering the earth, but systematic burial and erasure of existing structures. Look at basement windows at ground level across hundreds of cities. Examine buildings where the first floor sits partially underground, where grand entrances now require descending stairs that lead to what were clearly meant to be main floors. The earth rose around these structures, or the structures were deliberately buried, their original contexts erased. Photographs from the late 1800s show this process in action. Cities with streets clearly raised, buildings half submerged, workers adding fill dirt to cover lower levels. The official explanation claims this was normal urban development, raising streets for drainage and sanitation. But the scale doesn't match that explanation. Entire districts buried, architectural features obscured, evidence of previous civilizations covered and forgotten. What we call the mud flood might better be understood as coordinated erasure, a systematic removal of physical evidence that contradicted the narrative being constructed about human history and capability. If buildings existed that demonstrated advanced knowledge, if structures stood that couldn't be explained within the accepted timeline of technological development, those structures needed to disappear. Burning them created convenient explanations, burying them hid what remained. Consider the sequence. First, fires sweep through major cities with suspicious regularity and coordination. Buildings burn that shouldn't burn, constructed of stone and materials supposedly fire-resistant. Then rapid reconstruction occurs, so rapid it defies the logistical capabilities of the era. Except perhaps the reconstruction wasn't construction at all, but revelation. Perhaps crews weren't building new structures, but uncovering and repurposing what already existed beneath accumulated earth and debris. The timeline matters here. These events cluster in a narrow window, primarily between 1850 and 1900. The same period when cartographic records show massive territorial relabeling. Tartaria disappears from maps. Independent regions become absorbed into expanding empires. Historical records get rewritten, and conveniently, fires eliminate physical evidence that might contradict the new official versions. I'm not proposing a single catastrophic flood. The evidence suggests something more deliberate and controlled, a phased operation to bury, burn, and rebuild the physical landscape while simultaneously rewriting the historical narrative. The mud wasn't a natural disaster. It was a tool used to cover structures that told the wrong story about who built this world and when. Look at the patterns of destruction. Cities don't burn randomly. The fires target specific districts, specific types of buildings, administrative centres, religious structures, buildings that might contain records or architectural evidence of previous civilizations. Meanwhile, certain structures survive untouched, conveniently preserved to fit the narrative being constructed. The Great Chicago Fire provides the clearest example. Massive destruction, yet certain buildings stand untouched within the burn zone. The official explanation blames wind patterns and fire breaks, but examine the survivors. They're the buildings that fit the story of westward expansion and American progress. The ones that burned, those that might have raised uncomfortable questions about origins and builders. San Francisco, Boston, New York, London. The pattern repeats globally. Major urban centres experience devastating fires during this same narrow historical window. Each fire followed by rapid reconstruction that produces cities looking strangely uniform in their architectural sophistication, as if following a template, as if revealing something that was already there, waiting beneath the surface. What kind of civilization leaves buildings designed to be buried? Or more accurately, what kind of operation buries a civilization's buildings while claiming they never existed? The mud flood wasn't about water and sediment. It was about control. Control over history, over evidence, over the narrative of human capability and achievement. The buildings that survived this erasure, the ones we're told represent frontier ingenuity, they're not proof of what pioneers could build. They're remnants of what someone wanted hidden. And the fires that supposedly destroyed so much, those weren't accidents or natural disasters. They were controlled demolitions disguised as tragedy. The technique reveals itself when you examine which structures burned and which didn't. Fire doesn't discriminate based on architectural significance, yet somehow buildings containing historical records vanished while newer administrative structures survived. Courthouses with land registries from earlier eras? Gone. Churches with baptismal records stretching back generations? Destroyed. Meanwhile, banks constructed just years before the fires stood untouched. Insurance records from these fires expose another problem. Claims were settled with unusual speed, almost as if the paperwork had been prepared in advance. Rebuilding began before the ashes cooled. Construction crews appeared with materials already sourced, architectural plans already drawn. The official timeline suggests superhuman efficiency. The alternative explanation suggests foreknowledge. Now examine the architecture that emerged from these ashes. Virtually identical across continents. State capitals in America, administrative buildings in Europe, government complexes in Asia, all sharing the same proportions, the same construction methods, the same decorative elements. We're told this reflects the spread of architectural trends and shared aesthetic values. But trends don't explain precision. They don't account for buildings thousands of miles apart using identical mathematical ratios in their design. What if these structures weren't built after the fires? What if they were revealed by them? The mud flood theory proposes that previous civilizations' buildings were buried under accumulated sediment over time. But there's another possibility. The burial was deliberate. Cover what you can't explain. Burn what you can't bury. Then claim credit for whatever remains visible. State capitals provide the clearest evidence. Iowa's Capitol building, supposedly constructed between 1871 and 1886. 15 years to build a structure of that complexity with the technology available? The mathematics alone would require years just to calculate. The stone sourcing, the transportation, the precision cutting and placement, all accomplished by a frontier state with limited resources and a sparse population. Or consider the alternative. The building already existed. It needed cleaning, perhaps some restoration, maybe modifications to fit the new occupants' purposes. Suddenly 15 years becomes plausible. You're not constructing from nothing. You're adapting what's already there. This pattern repeats globally. Grand buildings appear in locations that supposedly lacked the population, resources, or technical knowledge to construct them. The official explanation requires accepting that primitive societies achieved architectural feats we struggle to replicate today. That makes sense only if you ignore the evidence suggesting they didn't build them at all. The technology question becomes critical here. How did civilizations, without modern tools, achieve such precision? The standard answer involves massive labor forces and simple machines. Thousands of workers moving stone with ropes and pulleys, cutting with primitive tools, measuring with basic instruments. Yet when modern engineers attempt to replicate these methods, they fail. The precision isn't achievable. The timeline doesn't work. Unless the tools weren't primitive, unless the civilization that built these structures possessed capabilities we've forgotten or been taught to deny. Airship hangars offer a perfect example. Massive structures designed to house vessels of enormous size. We're shown photographs from the early 1900s depicting rigid airships and their hangars. The official story claims this represents the peak of airship technology, a brief period of innovation before heavier-than-air flight made them obsolete. But examine the hangars themselves. Their construction methods suggest they're much older than claimed. The engineering principles, the materials, the scale, these aren't experimental structures built for a new technology. They're purpose-built facilities constructed by a civilization that used airships as standard transportation. The photographs we're allowed to see show small airships, primitive designs, early experiments. What if those images document not the height of airship technology, but its remnants? What if the original vessels were far larger, far more sophisticated, capable of continental or even global travel? That would explain why the hangars seem oversized for the craft we're shown. They weren't built for those primitive experiments. They were built for the real thing, the technology that preceded the reset and mostly disappeared along with everything else. Travel across any continent and you'll find identical architectural elements in the most unlikely places. Remote regions that supposedly had no contact with major urban centres. Yet their administrative buildings, their courthouses, their civic structures all share the same design language, the same proportions, the same decorative mathematics, the same construction precision. Conventional history explains this through travelling architects and shared design books. But that requires accepting that isolated communities, all independently, decided to adopt the same expensive, complex architectural systems. That frontier towns with limited budgets all chose to build far beyond their apparent needs. The simpler explanation: these buildings predate the communities that now surround them. The towns grew around existing structures, not the other way around. The architecture came first. The official history came later. This matters because it reveals method. If you wanted to hide a previous civilization's existence, you wouldn't need to destroy everything. Just enough to create confusion. Just enough to make the remaining evidence seem anomalous rather than systematic. Then fill the gaps with a narrative that attributes the survivors to your own civilization's achievements. The fires accomplished this perfectly. They created blank spaces in the historical record, convenient gaps where evidence once existed, and into those gaps you insert whatever story serves your purposes. The mud completed the process. What fire couldn't reach, sediment covered. Buildings that told the wrong story about technological capability and timeline got buried. Not all at once, not through a single catastrophic flood. Through deliberate, controlled operations that made the burial seem natural, inevitable, unremarkable. The result? A landscape dotted with architectural marvels that officially shouldn't exist. Buildings too sophisticated for their supposed builders, structures that predate the civilizations credited with their construction. Evidence hiding in plain sight, explained away by stories that collapse under examination. And the most troubling aspect, how completely the system works. Most people accept whatever explanation requires the least mental effort. The architectural wonders surrounding us get attributed to recent construction, to the ingenuity of our immediate ancestors. It's comfortable. It fits the story we've been taught. And questioning it means acknowledging something far more unsettling. That we might be living among the ruins of something we didn't build and can't replicate. Walk into any major city's government district. Look at the buildings actually used for administration. Not the showpieces, not the tourist attractions. The working structures where bureaucrats file paperwork and hold meetings. Notice anything? The ceilings soar 15, 20 feet high. The doorways tower. The windows stretch beyond any practical need for natural light. Why would you build this way if humans average 6 feet tall? You wouldn't, unless the buildings weren't designed for us. The Iowa State Capitol stands as perfect evidence. Examine its proportions, its construction methods, the precision of its stonework. Then examine the official timeline, claiming it was built in the late 1800s by frontier workers with primitive tools. The story doesn't hold. The mathematics alone requires knowledge that supposedly didn't exist in that region at that time. Yet there it stands, undeniable, physical, real. Touch those walls yourself. Feel the cold stone. This isn't theory. This isn't speculation about distant lands or ancient mysteries. This is your backyard, your state, your immediate accessible reality. And it's everywhere. Cleveland, New Orleans, St. Petersburg, Delhi. The pattern repeats with disturbing consistency. Beautiful, sophisticated structures that officially were built recently, yet show engineering principles and construction techniques that exceed what we're told was possible. The Golden Age theory helps explain this, not as mystical fantasy, but as practical framework. If civilizations rise and fall in cycles, each reaching different peaks before collapse, then what we're seeing makes sense. The first era built structures so massive we can barely recognize them as artificial. The second gave us pyramids. The third created star forts and geometric landscape modification. The fourth, the Tartarian age, achieved a balance we've lost. Buildings that served both society and individual. Architecture that enhanced spiritual health rather than draining it. Then came the fall, through infiltration, through corruption from within, through deliberate division of once unified peoples. The great buildings stopped being maintained. Energy systems failed or were deliberately shut down. Knowledge holders died without passing on their understanding. And what remained got buried, burned, or repurposed. Our current era, the fifth, builds with glass and steel. Disposable architecture for a disposable age. We're told this represents progress, advancement, the pinnacle of human achievement. Yet anyone with eyes can see these structures lack the permanence, the beauty, the spiritual resonance of what came before. This matters because understanding our actual past changes everything about our present. If we're not the first civilization to reach this level of development, if we're actually rebuilding from collapse rather than advancing into unknown territory, then the assumptions underlying our entire social structure become questionable. Why do we accept scarcity when previous civilizations apparently achieved abundance? Why do we tolerate division when they maintained unity? Why do we build ugly when they built beautiful? The answer might be that we've been conditioned to accept less, to believe that struggle defines human existence, that conflict is inevitable, that the best we can hope for is survival, not thriving. But the buildings tell a different story. They whisper of capabilities we've forgotten, of knowledge we've lost, of potential we're told doesn't exist. Consider what happens when you accept this possibility, when you acknowledge that the official history might be incomplete, deliberately misleading, or entirely fabricated. Everything shifts. the narrative claiming linear progress, from primitive to advanced collapses. The assumption that our current systems represent the best possible arrangements falls apart. You start asking different questions. Not how do we improve what we have, but what did we lose that needs recovering? Not how do we advance forward, but how do we remember backward? This isn't about romanticizing the past or rejecting modern life entirely. It's about recognizing that we might be living in diminished circumstances while being told we're at the peak, that the ruins surrounding us represent not the beginning of our journey, but evidence of how far we've fallen. The evidence remains accessible. The Iowa State Capitol isn't hidden. Cleveland's Marble Room serves diners daily. These structures exist in plain sight, waiting for people willing to actually look at them rather than through them. And once you start seeing, you can't stop. The pattern emerges everywhere. In the oversized doorways of courthouses, in the impossible precision of old masonry, in the architectural mathematics that shouldn't exist according to official timelines, in the construction methods that exceed what primitive tools could achieve. The system works because most people never question it. They accept the comfortable explanations. They trust the authorities who claim to know better. They dismiss anyone suggesting otherwise as conspiracy theorists or fantasists. But the buildings don't lie. Stone doesn't fabricate stories. Mathematical proportions don't bend to accommodate false narratives. The physical evidence persists regardless of what official histories claim. So the question becomes not whether a previous advanced civilization existed. The evidence for that stands all around us. The question is why that truth has been so thoroughly buried. What power structure benefits from keeping humanity ignorant of its actual capabilities? What control depends on people believing they're at the beginning rather than trying to climb back from a fall? These aren't rhetorical questions. They're the foundation of everything that follows. Because if we don't know our true history, we can't understand our true identity. And without that understanding, we remain perpetually vulnerable to manipulation by those who do know but choose to conceal. The buildings remember what we've been taught to forget. They stand as silent witnesses to capabilities we're told never existed. And they wait for the moment when enough people finally look up from their daily distractions and actually see what's been hiding in plain sight all along. The mud wasn't a flood, it was a method. Cover what contradicts the narrative. Burn what you can't cover. Then write the history books for whoever emerges confused and disoriented from the erasure. You can verify this yourself. Go to your state capital, touch those walls. Measure those doorways. Ask yourself honestly whether the official timeline makes sense. Whether frontier workers with primitive tools really achieved that precision, that scale, that mathematical perfection. The answer sits in the architecture itself, in the basement windows at ground level, in the buried first floors, in the construction methods that exceed modern capabilities. The evidence doesn't require faith, it requires willingness to see what's actually there. What we call progress might be recovery. What we celebrate as innovation might be rediscovery. And what we accept as the natural order of human civilization might be the result of a deliberate reset designed to keep us perpetually starting over, never quite remembering what we once knew. The buildings wait, stone is patient, and truth, no matter how deeply buried, eventually surfaces for those willing to dig.